I was speaking before the event with Jovan, and he made a very interesting point, which is that in academic gatherings, we're used to mixing things. Right? We have multimedia, we have multicultural, we have interdisciplinary. The one thing we usually don't get is intergenerational. There's often quite a segregation where a certain generation of thinkers consider the others as, oh, they're my former students and don't take them quite as seriously as their peers. So I'm going to try to break that a bit tonight by writing about a much younger philosopher than myself, Tristan Garcia. And this is the book that was published last year in the series of which Patrice is the co-editor, Forme et Objet, Un traité des choses, or Form and Object, a treatise on things. If you read French, you should get this book and read it as soon as you can. If you don't read French, it shouldn't be too long before an English version appears, I hope, because the book is of such interest. You can see how long it is. And for a 31-year-old philosopher to have written something this systematic and that works this well is quite remarkable. I've not seen anything else like this in my lifetime. So, I'm going to read a paper about Garcia. I will try not to read too fast, which is my usual problem, but I also don't want to keep you sitting here too long, and so I'm going to strike a balance between speed and slowness. In September 2009, Presses Universitaires de France launched its MétaphysiqueS series with a reprint of Souriau, I believe Souriau's was the first, reprint of...
Viveiros.
Simultaneous? Oh, okay. Souriau's long-forgotten Les différents modes d'existence with a long introductory essay by Latour and Stengers, and I guess the Viveiros de Castro was simultaneous. Didn't realize that. During the nearly 3 ensuing years, the series has drawn increasing attention. Through the work of its 4 energetic editors, Élie During, Patrice Maniglier, Quentin, Meillassoux, and Rabouin, the series has already established itself as one of the beacons of another important wave of philosophy from Paris, the city which has dominated the field since the Second World War. Another beacon in Paris, not yet as well known as the series at PUF, is the even younger group of thinkers associated with Raphaël Millier's group ATMOC, or Atelier du Métaphysique et d'Ontologie Contemporaine at the École Normale Supérieure. An English-language mirror site of the ATMOC website will soon be available and will show Anglophone readers that their repeated calls for a merger of analytic and continental philosophy is almost a fait accompli in Paris, perhaps the last city expected to serve as the headquarters of such a merger. But speaking of mergers, which person embodies both the exciting new series at PUF and the fascinating basement seminars of young Millier and his comrades? That person would be Tristan Garcia, born as recently as 1981, but already a force to be reckoned with in European philosophy. His massive book, Forme et Objet, Un traité des choses, or Form and Object, a treatise on things, was published last November. It has already been the subject of numerous reviews, most of them written in a spirit of admiration. Forme et Objet has also served as a rallying point for younger French thinkers who admire the author's verve and style. Garcia has followed the book with several additional lectures, despite his announced intention of retreating for a year into his other life as a writer of fiction. Garcia, who is both intensely prolific and remarkably friendly, seems ready to take his place among the most discussed philosophers of the decades to come. Everyone interested in European philosophy will want to become familiar with the basic concepts of Garcia's philosophy relatively soon, and this should be much easier in the Anglophone world once we have an English version of Forme et Objet on the shelves, which I hope will be within the next few years. My talk tonight has a twofold goal. For those who have heard little of Garcia, I want to explain the key points of his ontology. I will begin by covering the first portion of Forme et Objet. The first half of the book is entitled Formally and deals with things n'importe quoi, or no matter what they are. In other words, Garcia begins by establishing what Manuel de Landa calls a flat ontology, one that treats all things simply insofar as they are things and not according to any sort of hierarchy. This portion of Garcia's book is marked by an abstract technical precision reminiscent of Hegel's Science of Logic. The second half of Garcia's book, which I will not discuss today, gives us something more like Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirits, as various concrete shapes of reality pass before us from one to the next: time, culture, economics, gender, death, and other specific topics. Even for those who do not agree with Garcia's basic principles, the second half of the book poses an immediate challenge for contemporary philosophy to move from general technical discussions to a more concrete philosophy of life. Garcia has simply spent less time procrastinating than those of us in the now middle-aged generation of speculative realism, all of us in our mid-40s, some of us fairly prolific, but none of us so quick to deliver encyclopedic philosophical claims as Garcia has already done in this book. Though he is a full generation younger than we are, we suddenly find ourselves in the position of having to catch up with this unexpected sprinter. In the second half of my talk, I will discuss a recent lecture that Garcia gave at Atmos in Paris on his similarities and differences from the Austrian philosopher Alexius Meinong, a member, along with Twardowski, Husserl, and others, of the so-called Brentano school based in Vienna. Meinong is often treated by the likes of Russell and Quine as a needlessly inflationary ontologist who allows non-existent and even contradictory objects to exist. This resulting situation of a rampant multiplication of entities often leads to complaints about what is called Meinong's jungle. Garcia runs in the opposite direction, claiming that Meinong should have been even more inflationary, that he betrayed his own principles in serving up an ontology that is not sufficiently flat. That is the meaning of the phrase Garcia's jungle, my title tonight, which by Garcia's own admission is even thicker or at least flatter than Meinong's jungle. Garcia also hints in passing that my own ontology is not as flat as his. On this point, Garcia is definitely correct. Object-oriented philosophy, at least in my version of it, has never been entirely flat. My ontology is slightly bumpy, as seen most easily from the fourfold structure of real objects, real qualities, sensual objects, and sensual qualities. And I'll leave it to Ian Bogos to discuss that tomorrow, I guess. The quadruple model of objects is a direct challenge to flatness. For this reason, after summarizing Garcia's points about Meinong, I will say something about my own differences from Garcia, though only very briefly. Our time, Garcia begins the book, is perhaps one of an epidemic of things. What he seems to have in mind is the flurry of industrially produced objects, of media-generated images, of informational entities in the internet, all joining the still present tangible physical entities of earlier civilizations, such as farm animals, herbs and spices, and all the objects cluttering junkyards. The sheer size of this armada of things makes it difficult at first to put them in any sort of hierarchy. As Garcia continues, still on the first page of his book, it becomes difficult to forbid anything from being equally something, neither more nor less than another thing. We live in this world of things where a cutting of acacia, a gene, a computer-generated image, a transplantable hand, a musical sample, a trademarked name, or a sexual service are comparable things. The very spirit of the age encourages a flat ontology, to use Delanda's term again. It is also important for Garcia that after 2 centuries of philosophies of human access to the world, that the pendulum should swing to the other side, and that we should start to speak of things again. But these are merely transient local reasons for focusing on things. The real reason, Garcia argues, is that while a philosophy of things is capable of doing justice to minds as special cases of things, the reverse is not true. Just as geese, baby geese, are imprinted by the first living creature they see as a maternal object, philosophers who begin with human thoughts are imprinted by this gesture and never escape from it, never bring us back to the things. In order to do justice to things, our ontology must be as flat as possible, so that nothing at all is left out. Things must be de-determined to the point where everything is included. In Garcia's words, the goal of this de-determination is to have at one's disposal a cross-sectional plane of every container, of every order, which maps the relief of the physical, biological, animal, and human universe, of artifacts, of works of art, of economic networks of production, of exchange and consumption, of differences of classes, of genders, and of ages. Probably not Patrice's favorite phrase from Tristan's book. Garcia invites us to consider 3 different models of things. The first is the classical model, in which predicates or accidents are like tributaries feeding a mighty river of substance, in a purely hierarchical relation where the substance dominates the predicates. Garcia describes this classical model with a contemporary example. He says, if I become attached to the being of some redness, the texture of denim, and some cut or pattern in the form of an hourglass, I can imagine 3 arrows carrying the being of red, the being of denim, and the being of the form of an hourglass in the direction of a 4th arrow, a dress, which is red, denim, and in the form of an hourglass. And yet the dress is not predicated on anything, while the red, denim, or form of an hourglass are predicated on the dress. The problem here is the hasty hierarchy that does not permit things to be considered in their democratic flatness. But the second model is more contemporary, more fashionable. As Garcia describes it, the second model consists not in distributing being substantially, but vectorially. One thus conceives trajectories of being, identified with events, facts, powers, intensities, or intentionality. These vectors of being come first, bearing and supporting being, displacing it, but without ever finding a stopping point, a buffer, or an objective consistency. In such a representation, that which is in the world is not identity, but difference, trajectory, becoming, a continuous projection of being which never opens onto a compact being, closed upon itself. There is no in itself. Being is never an arrow whose direction turns around towards its own flight. Nothing is self-contained or sealed. The ontological plane is open and extends by flows, forces, and becomings. To give an account of the apparent existence of things, of identifiable and re-identifiable stable entities, this model conceives the possibility of determining figures at the intersection of different trajectories. Garcia rejects this as well, of course. The problem with this model, according to him, is that it tends to dissolve, to disseminate being, and it transforms things into effects, illusions, or secondary realities. For Garcia, both of these two models are equally false. For the first produces a thing which is too much a thing, which is compact, that's the substance, while the second generates a thing which is not thing enough, which is a construction, a volatile projection. After discounting both of these models just a dozen pages into his book, Garcia immediately shares with us the key to his own philosophy. Namely, the thing is neither in itself nor in its effects, but rather is the difference between these two. So a thing is always the difference between what makes it and what it enters into, the difference. So the two great philosophical questions for Garcia are these. What are things made of, and what do things make? What is the basic stuff of the cosmos, and what is the structure of the cosmos as a whole? We might even say, what is the small and what is the big? Which is, I guess, the division of labor between quantum theory and relativity in physics as well. For Garcia, everything embodies both of these questions, since everything is the point where these two opposing currents meet. He shares the fine example of a piece of black slate, which has already captured the imagination of several reviewers of the book, and deserves to be quoted here, even though it's a bit long. Let me apologize in advance. Take, for example, a block of black slate, a random rectangular sample taken from the space of continental collision. Few people will object that this block, or will deny that this block is a thing. Obviously, one will be able to point out that it is necessary to have an active subjectivity to divide or distinguish this block of matter lying on the ground or dusty soil in order to perceive it as such. But this slice of black slate possesses certain qualities of cohesion and of solidity that allow one to dissociate it from its environment, manipulate it, transport it, and consider it quite simply as something. What is it composed of? It contains quartz, clay-like minerals, mica, some traces of feldspar. And all these components themselves have a certain atomic structure. But in a wider sense, they also enter into the constitution of the rock as thing, its rectangular form, the irregularities of its surface, the porphyroblasts coated with pyrite, its somber color, its delicate texture, its weight, its fragility, because it is extremely easy to break, and all the primary or secondary qualities by which we can recognize the black slate. We will say that this is everything which is in this thing, every path of being which leads to the constitution of this black slate in my hands. And yet from everything which is in this slate is never to be inferred that in which it is. Among everything which composes it, I will not find the position of the slate in the world, the relations in which it inscribes itself, the fact that it is now in my hand, the function of a weapon that it can exercise if someone attacks me, but also its place in the landscape, its rank in the series of slices of slate scattered alongside this valley. That which it is, this unique thing which exists in the world, held in my hand, is outside itself. The slate can in fact enter in turn into the composition of the side of a mountain, a roof, or a collection of rocks. It is no longer a question of that which is in the slate, but that in which this slate is. So everything for Garcia is always torn in two directions, made up of both tendencies. The thing is that which is in it, that which makes it, and that in which it is, the environmental context in which you find it. This is Garcia's way of avoiding reductionism in either direction, and Garcia is very adamant in his anti-reductionism. When a philosophical theory tries to reduce things to substances or to events without considering the active difference between these two forces and everything, then such theories are treating things as compact, a word that means the same in French as in English, but which the English language owes to the French of the late 1300s and is ultimately derivable from the Latin compactus, meaning concentrated. Just as correlationism is Meillassoux' key polemical term, vorhanden is Heidegger's, and vacuous actuality is Whitehead's, so too is compact the major polemical term of Garcia's book. He laments as follows about theories of the compact. As if one were capable of reducing the black slate to being nothing but a material thing, or a natural thing, or a social thing. As if one then were capable of considering matter, nature, or society as things outside appearance, absolute, remaining in themselves. This specter of the compact, which will be the adversary of our entire adventure of thought, will only disappear on one condition. For each thing to have a sense, it must have two of them. Nature or history as things contain a multitude of things, that's the first sense, but they will in turn be contained by things other than themselves, the second sense. We should also mention Garcia's attitude towards two prominent terms in recent continental philosophy, realism and materialism. Despite his expression of gratitude towards speculative realists and speculative realism, Garcia himself shies away from the term realism, apparently because he does not find it sufficiently flat. He wants unreal and contradictory objects to be included in his ontology along with real ones, and seems to worry that realism will grant hierarchical priority to real things over imaginary ones. As for materialism, he is initially even harsher for the very same reason. We cannot privilege one type of thing, hard material physical entities over immaterial types, And Garcia even points out that it's very hard to give criteria for what constitutes a material object. Nonetheless, what Garcia appreciates in the term materialism is the idea that all entities should be of just one kind, with no special zone of spiritual or incorporeal entities following rules different from those of physical matter. The majority of our life, Garcia writes, consists not in saying, doing, seeing, or understanding no matter what, but rather in establishing differences of importance, that is to say, in limiting everything to a sphere of belonging, the interest in intimate life, familial life, its country, social class, culture, works of art, beauty, love, sexuality, sports, knowledge, certain practices, nature, animals, ideas. Within each of these possible spheres of interest, some things always matter more than others. That is to say, they belong in an eminent, exceptional manner to this domain, to this group, or to this microcosm. The majority of existence consists in defining, paying attention to, and defending what matters. Not so for Garcia's flat ontology, whose primary technical term is n'importe quoi, the thing no matter what it is. Nothing that exists could be a no matter what. Everything we think of is already something determinate. The no matter what is that which can be indifferently this or something which is not this, or even this and something which is not this. Nothing prevents no matter what from being a contradiction, but nothing constrains it from being contradictory either. It doesn't matter. Nonetheless, the no matter what is not nothing. On the contrary, no matter what, that is to say, equally this or that or every other thing, is something. One of the chief features of Garcia's attitude towards recent philosophy is that he thinks it lives in fear of the flattening power of things. As he puts it in one passage, human thought always conspires to resist a thingly epidemic, which carries in embryonic form the menacing power of the no matter what. Garcia identifies a number of different strategies for limiting the scope of thinghood, all of which he rejects. First, in such thinkers as Aristotle and Descartes, we find the idea that what is contradictory cannot be a thing. Second, in Wittgenstein's Tractatus, there is the attempt to exclude the unspeakable from the realm of things. Third, there is the transcendental strategy of largely restricting things to the knowable. Fourth, and somewhat amusingly, there is the cultural restriction of taboos that exiles certain things from the status of being acceptable things. Fifth, there is the concept of the sacred, in which certain things are taken to be more than things. It would obviously cause outrage in many circles to speak of Jesus or other prophets as being things, in the same sense as mailboxes, toasters, or grains of dust. In some contexts, this is still enough in the year 2012 to earn us death by hanging, beheading, or bombing. The sixth strategy strikes a bit closer to home among today's intellectuals who pride themselves on breaking cultural taboos and scoffing at sacred entities. This is the moral and political restriction on thinghood. As Garcia puts it so skillfully, the sixth strategy, moral and political, consists in establishing insurmountable differences of nature between things and certain goods, of sensible objects, of human individuals, of values, of works, or of ideas which must not be reified or lower to the level of things as other things. This risks the irremediable fall of every value and of every dignity. This is still Garcia. Marxism in a critical mode of alienation, of reification, has illustrated this just as well as classical liberalism in a contractual mode and in differentiating various types of justice, various possibilities of relation to goods and to persons. Today, universalist humanism as well as animal ethics embody this spirit by distinguishing the human being or the set of sensible suffering beings from other things. In this way, it is not just religious people who exclude certain entities from thinghood. The same holds for portions of the political left as well, with their ongoing complaints that object-oriented philosophies are guilty of commodity fetishism, even though Marx only claimed that value is constituted by social relations of production, not that reality itself is thereby produced. In other words, the charge of fetishism cannot arise when someone merely says that trees exist when no one is looking, but only from saying that trees have an inherent value, even when all humans are absent. For Garcia, everything which exists, no matter what it is something rather than indifferent no matter what. Contradictions are always specific contradictions. The square circle is not the same thing as the odd number 6, since both flout logic in highly distinct ways. The non-white white and the non-city city are different affronts to the logician, not the same one. The same is more even obviously true of taboos, which are highly specific in each case and often transmuted into non-taboos, in which case their objects become explicit subjects again. The 6-year-old with a horse phobia might someday become the world's leading horse trainer, for instance. Even the sacred, which often creates its object for the first time as an exception to the existing order, worships a god of a specific character, however vaguely this character might be known. The same is true for both the inexpressible and the unknowable. As Garcia puts it in another wonderful extended passage, if I walk alongside a property which is forbidden to me, drawing up a plan of its walls, I certainly don't have access to whatever is found in this mysterious place, but I can still map the contour of this estate. I can visualize the form of that which escapes me, the outline of its inclusion on the worlds. I know, therefore, that which this property is, its form, without knowing that which is this property. that is to say, whatever is found inside the residence. In other words, although I find myself condemned to never enter the manor, I would have known at least that the manor is something in the world, whatever it encloses. Even that which I do not know, that is to say, that for which the coming and going is judged impossible, that which is between that in which the thing is and that which is in this thing, I must know that it is something, in the absence of knowing that which is this something. The same holds even for the supposed exception of humans from the status of thinghood. For we do not take an equal interest in all injustices, nor are we always more interested in all people than in certain inanimate things. For Garcia, it is necessary to comprehend in order to be able to respect the human person as a thing like other things, which is no longer a better something than a duck, a pebble, a speck of dust, a chair, a word, or the entire sky. It is always necessary to know at what point, no matter what is something, so that we can perceive and defend objective differences between things. Reification, the reduction of our world to a world of things, is not an evil, a dehumanization, a desensitization, or a disenchantment of the world, but the precondition of a humane comprehension of the differences between things. A system of exception to the world of things is never a system of moral or just thought. It is a metaphysical system of the determination of inequalities between things, of more than things, which cannot be a part of itself. But what is the status of this no matter what that Garcia wants to talk about in his book? Is it linguistic? Is it for us? Is it in itself a simple abstraction? Or what is it exactly? For Garcia, all of these questions miss the point, since the no matter what already encompasses all of them. It concerns the possibility of being either real or possible, or real and possible, or neither real nor possible, either constructed or given, either natural or natural and artificial, either true or illusory, of not being all of these at once, but of indifferently being capable of registering or not one of these determinations, whatever it is. To this realm of absolute extensity, we can oppose intensity of values, which turns out to be a very important concept later in Garcia's book, so I'll leave that for then. In the second half of the book, intensity and valorization play an important role in allowing Garcia to explore multiple specific topics in the manner of Hegel's phenomenology of spirits, rather than that of the science of logic. But in the first half of the book, the portion on which we are focusing tonight, the discussion of how some things matter and are important sets the table for Garcia's concept of worlds, which links up in turn with his conception of form. In order for some things to matter more than others, to be either more beautiful for us or in relation to some idea that we have of them, or more ugly, more true, more false, better or worse, it is necessary that a plane exists on which no thing is more real or less a thing than another. This plane is situated neither beyond nor below our values from which we could abstract, or that we ought to attack with a hammer, or to fully deconstruct. It is nothing other than the plane of reference of our importances. The flat world, where no thing is more important than another, supposes neither an abstraction nor a reduction, neither asceticism nor critique, neither genealogy nor deconstruction. The flat world is neither more nor less real than the planes on which the importances are played out, where things are exchanged, where we give to them or receive from them as so many variable intensities. This is the flat world of the no matter what. For Garcia, the 20th century taught us repeatedly that no matter what could be something. Painting, for instance, set out to represent the red without any longer representing the table, at the moment of the modern passage to abstraction in a Rothko canvas or a Klein monochrome, giving to this color a status of something possibly independent, for the same reason that the table or the chair were substances. And everything which seemed, on account of metaphysical arguments, to benefit from a status of more than things was progressively lowered to the level of a mere thing, something, not everything and not nothing. Despite this increasing flatness of daily life and aesthetic achievement, modernity also had a tendency to split the world reductively into what Garcia calls more than things and less than things. As when the sciences turned atoms and other tiny particles into super things, while rendering ideas less than things, since they only inhere in physical matter. And here again, Garcia returns to the basic claim of his ontology of the in-between. A more than thing is that which is in itself, a less than thing is that which is in and by another thing. With this gesture, Garcia tacitly agrees with my own critique of undermining and overmining, with the major difference that he assigns the in itself to the undermining side, whereas for me, the in itself is what is between the two extremes of composition and relationality. There are numerous further riches in the first half of Garcia's book, but for the sake of time, we limit ourselves to a few key points. One is that the thing is not only a middle ground between that which is in it and that in which it is also a milieu, a middle ground between the no matter what and the not no matter what. In Garcia's words, that which enters into something is no matter what. That in which something enters is not no matter what. No matter what is something and something is not no matter what. Each thing is thus a milieu, a fragile link between no matter what and not no matter what. Each thing relies on its relation to something else which is not another thing, namely the flat world of the no matter what. A thing is not necessarily one, since this would be another way of curtailing a purely flat ontology, and for Garcia, unity is always relational, since a thing is one only with respect to other things. But it is always alone. A thing is always alone insofar as it is related to the flat world of the no matter what. But on the other side of the coin, insofar as it relates to other things, it is what Garcia calls an object. Things can communicate only insofar as they are alone in the world. Two lovers are always alone, says Garcia, in his most poignant but also familiar example, since Rilke had already made the point so forcefully. Being simply means to be contained by something else, to be present in some environment, which is why for Garcia the question of being is a false mystery from the start. There is also and always Garcia's critique of the compact, which we can leave for later. Let's turn now instead to Garcia's interesting lecture on Meinong, which was delivered on April 13th at the Atmos seminar in Paris. It's getting very hot in here. The initial similarities between Garcia and Meinong are obvious enough. Like the earlier philosopher, Garcia urges that we not restrict in advance what can or cannot count as a thing. He insists that Forme Objet is not a neo-Meinongian book, that it proposes an entirely different theory of the object. Garcia defends what he calls the weak ontological constraint in Meinong, or what he calls the wild initial impulse in Meinong, rather than the mild backtracking of Meinong and his later scholastic followers. From the very start, Garcia sees one problem with Meinong that stems from his legacy in the Brentano school. Consciousness has an intentional structure. This makes consciousness a special kind of entity in the philosophy, and it remains unclear whether Meinong regards consciousness itself as an object or as something better than an object. At the same time, it is always clear that there cannot be an object that would not be the object of a possible consciousness. There can be no thing in itself outside of possible observation. As Garcia puts it, the first consequence of this separation inherited by Meinong is that an object, unlike intentional consciousness, has no object. Objects do not encounter other objects. And the second is that which has an object is not truly an object. Stated differently, it would make no sense to speak of consciousness as one object in the world among others, as we can already see in Husserl's aversion to any kind of naturalistic model of consciousness. And secondly, it would make no sense to speak of things in themselves that would not be possible objects of conscious awareness. Another point easily visible in Husserl, no less than Meinong. The things must be observable by consciousness or they are not things. This is the first of several constraints found in Meinong that make Garcia uneasy. Meinong begins by trying to be as flat and democratic as possible, to be able to consider contradictory objects, imaginary objects, unreal objects on the same footing as real physical ones. But Meinong quickly starts to add needless conditions to this flatness. Garcia's aim is to adopt the radical initial thought of Meinong and push it further, to follow the spirit rather than the letter of Meinong's philosophy. For Russell, Quine, and other opponents of Meinong in analytic philosophy, it is necessary to have what Garcia calls a strong ontological constraint. If every possible thing exists, then we will have objects that both exist and non-exist simultaneously, such as unicorns, square circles, and the white, non-city city. In other words, there is a preeminence of being over the object for Russell and Quine. The problem that motivates Meinong and his weak ontological constraint is precisely the reverse. If there are things that do not count as objects according to the strong constraint, then we are left with a number of sub-objects whose ontological status will be unclear. The non-circle circle must be something, since we understand what it means, and if it is not an object, then we will face the burden of knowing what it is. Or as Garcia puts it, between the weak ontological constraint and the strong ontological constraint, we witness the birth of a genuine dilemma. Each of the two positions is in fact haunted by a paradox which is the negative of the other. The paradox that haunts the strong ontological constraint is as follows. As soon as we accept that there are objects which are not, we find ourselves with objects which simultaneously are and are not. The contradiction here bears upon being. The paradox which haunts the weak ontological constraint is this. If we do not accept that there are objects which do not exist, then we find ourselves with something which will not be something. The paradox here bears upon the entity. In Meinong's responses to Russell, we get the sense that he wants non-contradiction to be a local or regional principle governing certain kinds of entities and not others. Much as Newtonian physics will be preserved as a special case of Einstein's theory for entities that are not massive and not too close to the speed of light. For the defenders of a strong ontological constraint, the fact that a contradiction can lead to anything whatever means that a contradiction is anything whatever. But for Garcia, the decisive argument in favor of a weak constraint is that even a contradiction is not no matter what. It is necessary that determinations be attributed to it, so that a square circle and a non-unicorn unicorn are two different contradictions, not the same one. But Garcia does not only complain about the likes of Russell and Quine and their strong constraints. He is equally negative towards what he calls the neo-Meinongian scholastics, who spend too much energy in classifying different types of objects out of a fear for Garcia that is little different than that of Russell and Quine, the fear of a bloated universe in which everything would be equally real. Thus, we find them distinguishing between real objects which have being, ideal objects which have being, non-existent non-contradictory objects, non-existent contradictory objects, incomplete objects such as the object which is not blue, and other such categories. The problem with these neo-Meinongian theories is that they try to be both liberal and classificatory at the same time, and rather than the best of both worlds, this leads them to the worst of both worlds. The original wild impulse behind Meinong's theory is tamed and betrayed, rendered mediocre. The real problem faced by Meinong, according to Garcia, is internal. There are three competing constraints on things in his philosophy. Let's start with the first, the representational constraint. As already mentioned, the Brentano school is obsessed with the problem of representations without objects. What if you're representing something in your mind that does not really exist? But they leave no room for the problem of objects without representations. This is something the Brentano school tends to consider impossible, and this is the flaw that later develops into Husserl's full-blown idealism, that there cannot be a thing that would not be representable by consciousness. Stated differently, there is no room in Meinong for object-object relations without the presence of human observers. His theory of objects is implicitly a theory of human referenced objects. And in fact, Garcia asks, why should I think that the table and the paperweight enter into relation as objects only from the moment when I enter into relation with the relation? Recalling Meillassoux' archifossil, Garcia notes that the world existed for billions of years before representing entities appeared, such as humans. If it is countered that inanimate entities could have been represented, Garcia would answer simply that they were not represented, yet they somehow related nonetheless. But Meinong's wish to be as liberal as possible in determining what counts as a thing is fatally undercut by his strong constraint that all things should be representable by consciousness. Next, we can see that Meinong adds other implicit constraints to his otherwise liberal position on what counts as a thing. One of them concerns temporal identity. Is the table at time t1 the same as the table at time t2 and time t3? One can certainly adopt this standpoint, but it already presupposes a hierarchy in which the fleeting individual moments of a table are ontologically derivative of a deeper table nucleus that endures through all of those moments. The same problem arises in connection with space. What are the relations between the parts of an object and the whole? Between table legs, tabletop, and table? Between the atoms and molecules of the table? Are all of them equally objects? Or rather, are they parts of a superior object? So, are parts somehow less than things? Are they first-class and second-class objects? All of these questions indicate that Meinong wants to allow for a liberal flatness of objects and at the same time for their classification into higher and lower kinds of objects. The final problem for Meinong's scheme of classification is what to do with events. His defenders cannot just claim that Meinong only cares about objects and not about events, because one cannot be neutral in this question. The 20th century made every effort to demonstrate that objects are undermined by events and are merely abstractions from these events. The Heideggerian Aragnus, Whiteheadian process, Bergsonian becoming, the Badiouian event, Garcia says. In other words, perhaps a Meinongian theory of objects can never be sufficiently flat, since it distinguishes at the outset between things and the transient events in which things might become involved. All three of these problems explain why Garcia considers himself a friend of Meinong, but a greater friend of truth, since what he prefers is Meinong's wild initial impulse of flatness, sold too cheaply along the road. Garcia concludes the lecture with an interesting theory of the anxiety of influence. As he writes, every book of philosophy that imagines itself to be innovative is built on a disappointed reading of other philosophers. In building for ourselves a deformed image of a great philosopher who preceded us, we imagine that the philosopher finished on such or such a point by betraying that which we had initially found most precious in that philosopher. And though Garcia's own intellectual background was primarily in the Frankfurt School, his own nearest intellectual ancestor may in fact be Alexius Meinong. We have seen that what disappoints Garcia most in Meinong is his wavering between three incompatible constraints. The constraint that all objects must be representable, the constraint of being as liberal as possible in deciding what counts as a thing, and the constraint of having to classify different types of realities. In two key passages of the lecture, Garcia generously credits speculative realism with destroying the representational constraint, while also claiming his own contribution to a renovation of Meinong. As he puts it, the heritage of the contemporary critique of correlationism at work in speculative realism is particularly important for the project of form and object, because it allows me to fold the pole of representation, intentionality, or consciousness onto that of objective relations. Inheriting the already rather different conceptions of Graham, Harman, and Quentin Meillassoux with respect to correlationism, we use them in order to unburden ourselves of the requirement imposed on the object responding to subjectivity through a correlation that would have systematic primacy over both the subject and the object. The exit from the 20th century, instigated by speculative realism, liberated me, that's Garcia, from the intentional constraint. My own philosophical gesture consists in liberating myself from the constraint of classification, by splitting in two the object able to accommodate each thing and the object entering into relations among things. Let's briefly discuss what Garcia means by this before ending the lecture with some more general reflections on his position. The first impulse of thought, Garcia says, should be to seek the weakest constraint on what counts as a thing, be as broad as possible in deciding what philosophy can talk about. Philosophy should be able to include everything, no matter what it is. But there cannot be no constraint. After all, philosophy cannot treat no matter what as itself a thing, since everything is determined in some way and is never a no matter what. In this connection, Garcia often uses the unfamiliar term tenology, which is derived from the Greek word te for what, and was coined, as far as I can tell, by Pierre Cassou-Noguès. It is important for Garcia to insist against the Russell-Quine axis that contradictions do have some minimal determination. In a fascinating analysis, he explains the difference between various contradictions along the following lines. A non-human human, which is contradictory, of course, has the possibility of being a circle, but it does not have the possibility of being human or the possibility of being non-human, since it is constrained by definition to be both of these. But for a non-circle circle, the situation will be reverse. The non-circle circle would have the possibility of being human, since it is indeterminate with respect to humanity, but it is constrained to be a circle and also constrained to be a non-circle. Thus, the non-human human and the non-circle circle are two different things, not one, even though both are contradictory. To eliminate all constraints and allow for something to be purely indeterminate would be to compact no matter what, and we will speak more about the compact in a moment. Having any determination at all, it is all it takes to count as a thing. Any further determinations than this will be shared by some things and not others. And this, says Garcia, is what explains the fact that his book has two parts. The first part, entitled Formally, concerns only things qua things, having any determination at all rather than specific ones. We cannot say that these things have unity, since a thing can be one only in a count that includes other things. Instead, the things have solitude. They are alone in their solitude. In Garcia's strangely beautiful words, my hand is only something when it is the sole thing, when it is alone in the world. Where my hand is something, nothing else is something. All that which is not my hand is undifferentiated, as an outside, whether it be my finger, the blue of the sky, or the word hand. And where my finger is something, my hand is not. But insofar as things are not alone in their solitude, they either contain or are contained by other things. We have now left the field of things defined by the first half of the book and entered that of objects. The second half of Garcia's book is entitled Objectively, which are always greater or lesser, asymmetrical in their relations with one another. Atoms are contained in the coffee mug. The coffee mug is not contained by atoms. The state of being contained is how Garcia defines being, which for him is nothing mysterious at all. The opposition of being is not non-being, but to comprehend to the sense of to contain something else. Garcia admits that the targets of these ideas are the concepts of substance and the end itself, which I will discuss again at the conclusion. Just one key point remains. The concepts of being and comprehending concern the extensive relations between different things. But for Garcia, there are also intensive relations of things with themselves. A thing can be more or less itself insofar as it comes more or less in relation to itself, a difficult but important concept in Garcia's book. And now I'll conclude with just 2 pages. This has been a quick summary of a long and well-constructed book, but we are now in a position to raise a few questions about Garcia's model of the world. First, there is his observation that we can speak both of that which is in a thing and that in which a thing is, which is the key to his philosophy. In one sense, this means that a machine can be defined both by all of the pieces and components that are in it and by the environment in which the machine is situated, which gives it meaning. In another sense, Garcia also says that the no matter what is that which is in a thing rather than any tangible components. But let's leave this possible ambiguity aside for a moment and speak only of the first sense of his claim, which is the thing is situated between its components and its environment. It's the difference between those two. It's neither the one nor the other. You are not the cells in your body, and you are not the social role you play, but you are the difference between those two, according to Garcia. For my object-oriented philosophy, this means that the thing is identical neither with its components nor with its environments, since we can change a few atoms in a table without changing the table itself, and we can slide the table around on the floor without changing the table itself as well. The table, for me, is a thing in itself, situated between its components and environments, and not fully accessible to either. Whereas Garcia thinks of the table as the difference between its pieces and its environment. What surprises me about Garcia's position here are 2 things. First, he tends to identify the table in itself with that which is in the table, rather than simply identifying the table with the table in itself, meaning that Garcia tends to identify the table in itself with the pieces of the table. But why should we do that? Why should we identify the table in itself with table components? The pieces of a table are certainly a physical necessity for the table to exist, but no one claims that a table in itself exists as its pieces, other than hardcore materialists who think that the table in itself is nothing more than physical fields or particles, and of course such people don't believe the table exists anyway. They believe it can be eliminated in favor of the particles. Garcia's concept of that which is in a thing is also now somewhat cluttered, since it seems to include three things simultaneously: the components of a thing, the thing in itself, and the no matter what that is shared by all things in its indeterminacy. But the second point is of more immediate importance, and I made a similar critique of Bruno Latour in my book 3 years ago. Namely, Garcia defines the thing not as a hidden midpoint between its components and its environment, but as the difference between these two. The table is the difference between its parts and the environment in which it is positioned, and there are two problems with this. First, it suggests a game of hot potato in which reality is always to be found somewhere else than where we are standing. If the table is the difference between its components and its environment, both of these in turn are things that will be the difference between that which is below and above them. And we will have a world filled with differences but with no positive terms from which everything else can differ. But perhaps the bigger problem is that this will turn everything into a gigantic relational ontology. If I am the difference between my body and my social role, then I will be changing constantly anytime that either of these two changes. Whenever I inhale and exhale or lose a few cells, whenever I age by a few minutes, gain or lose blog followers, or when my retirement funds rise or fall in the stock market by a few euros, or even when my daily environment changes in some minor petty way, then I will become a different person. Entities are made too hypersensitively dependent on everything that surrounds them in this way. There will be nothing in the things that is protected by firewalls from outside changes. And as I have argued elsewhere, this will mean, as it does for all relational ontologies, including Whitehead's and Latour's, that everything will always be fully deployed in reality at every instant with nothing held in reserve. The sidewalk table 5 meters from the road is deeply constituted by its being exactly 5 meters from the road. There will be no table separate from 5 meters from the road, and thus it is impossible to see how the table can ever be moved without becoming a different table. Garcia has a conscious motivation here, of course. He is so committed to flatness that he does not want table 5 meters from the road to have a lesser ontological status than table in its own right. But the price to pay for this sort of flatness is that all objects must be fully determined at all times, completely in league with their components and their environment, and hypersensitive to all changes in both. There can be no objects that will be something over and above their current environmental determinations. For me, it is the mismatch between objects themselves and their current predicaments that allows for new things to happen, as previously compressed or hidden forces, hidden qualities are unleashed. For Meillassoux, this problem is handled through the radical contingency of all things, with anything able to happen at any moment for no reason whatsoever. But where, for Garcia, is the principle of dynamism in things? It's over, I'm not asking.